What's up guys, Law with CinemaBlend, and you're watching our analysis of episode 2 of Moon Knight.
What you're about to see is gonna melt your brain, yeah?
Now in this episode, we get a lot more action, a lot more lore, and a whole lot more Moon Knight. Last week, we talked a little bit about how this series departed from the comics, and we noticed that some of the commenters noticed that as well. Cam S gave us a shout out saying that this series is Moon Knight in name only, but I would argue that it's also Moon Knight in spirit. The MCU adapts things to make them more accessible to a wide audience, and I for one love what we're seeing as a Moon Knight fan. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we saw in episode 2. Now, before we dive in, you definitely want to make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and those notifications are turned on, because we're going to be doing this week by week, episode by episode, and you don't want to miss out.
You ready?
Yeah?
Roll the tape.
Right off the bat, we're going to want to talk about who is in control here. We see Marc and Steven interact for the first time in full dialogue. You know, we're seeing them kind of come to terms with the fact that one of them is going to be trapped in this reflection realm and the other one is in control of the body, which apparently the person who is not in that reflection realm seems to be stronger and has more control over who allows the alters to take over. But I think what's really important is near the end of the episode, Khonshu says that the body belongs to neither of them, it belongs to him. This is where we kind of tie it back into the comics, because Khonshu revives a Marc Spector dying in a desert, basically a corpse, and he makes him his avatar of vengeance. And when we're looking at the show, we're getting these bits of backstory without having to necessarily see it. In the end, I'm wondering, what is Khonshu up to? Can he be trusted, and how much don't we know? Now, I think it's important to note that even though Khonshu claims to have control, even Arthur Harrow in the episode is saying that all he can really do is blow some wind around or yell in your ear, because you, as the body, have control over his power. We'll have to see how that comes into play, because Khonshu is not necessarily the most trustworthy guy in the comics either. Another thing that really stood out to me is Mr. Knight, our first appearance of one of the coolest costumes from the comic, and he seems to just be Steven. I think that's a really big departure from the comics, whereas Moon Knight and Mr. Knight are their own kind of separate personalities with their own kind of ways of speech and crime fighting, in a sense. Now we are limiting kind of the amount of personalities that we're dealing with, so I'm really interested to see how that breaks down in the future. If Mr. Knight eventually turns into this informant detective style person that we know from the comics, what with Steven's voice and demeanor. Definitely remains to be seen, but I'm excited that Mr. Knight is in live action at all. Something also that was really interesting to me was that Steven's storage unit, or I guess Marc's storage unit, was the number 43. In the comics, that issue is called Multiple Maniacs, which could be allusion to that, I don't know. But of these maniacs that we've met so far, I still gotta say that Steven is still the most compelling to me. Marc seems to have a bit of a jaded look on the world, whereas Steven's still learning all these things, and he's crushing on Layla. There's so many things about him that make him endearing to watch, because he's discovering all of these new supernatural aspects to his life alongside us. We also get a good stance on what his morality is when he's talking to Harrow at the commune, and I just think he's a really good guy, whereas Khonshu even alludes to Marc enjoying bringing pain to other people. So it definitely seems like two sides of a coin here, and I'm really hoping we see how Steven rises up to the occasion and becomes a hero in his own right.
Well, no wonder your scales don't balance. It must be very difficult having all those voices inside one head.
Now let's switch over to Harrow for a bit, because we learn a lot more about his backstory, what his idea of an ideal world looks like, and it's basically like Minority Report, but in the MCU. He wants to stop the evil before it happens, and he has a really low moral line because he does not care about killing kids, even if, you know, they have their whole life ahead of them. That's something that Steven seemed to really disagree with at the commune. Now, my big question is, what led to Arthur Harrow and Khonshu parting ways? Because it seems like Khonshu enjoys the violence, enjoys bringing the vengeance, so what made them split? Why did Arthur and Khonshu disagree, and why is there kind of turbulence between them outside of that they're basically exes? I don't know. Harrow seems to know a lot about Khonshu. He knows how he operates, he knows how he intimidates, and he definitely does not seem to really fear him as long as he has Marc or Steven on his side. Since we're on the topic of avatars and Egyptian gods, we gotta ask ourselves, who was Ammit's former avatar? Now, we learned that the cane that Arthur Harrow uses to summon beasts and judge people with the scales, that is infused with the tiniest bit of power from Ammit that was given to her last avatar. I wonder if that's going to be important, if it's a lineage thing, like Arthur Harrow is in a long line of families that had the same kind of goal in mind. It's curious because in Egyptian culture, Ammit is the embodiment of everything that Egyptians feared. She wasn't revered necessarily, she was feared. I'm really curious to see how that develops and if that plays into how the scales work. Now let's talk about the scales, because it does not seem to be necessarily judging a good person versus a bad person. It's judging people based on if they're going to commit a crime in the future. But how's that determined? I'm really curious how that magic works. I feel like it doesn't necessarily spell itself out for us in the show, because people have been good their whole life, but eventually they'll do something evil. But isn't Arthur's commune and his people doing something evil by eradicating the world of these bad people? I don't know. Because I know in Egyptian culture, you're judging your soul against an ostrich feather, and that is what determines if you go to their hell or not. The scales definitely determine if you're going to live or die or join this commune, but I still am craving a little bit more information.
I can't help you.
Yes, you can.
Where's the scarab?
I haven't.
Now, of course, we can't talk about episode 2 without talking about the new challenger that approaches, Layla. Now, we heard her voice over the cell phone, but now we see her in the flesh. She saves Marc, or Steven. Sorry, I'm going to keep doing that throughout the rest of the series. But I think that Layla is important because to us as an audience member, she is our window to knowing about Moon Knight's past, specifically Marc's past. Now, they were married at one point, and she served him the divorce papers that he ordered, something like that. But all I know is that whatever relationship that Marc and Layla had is diminishing. Steven, on the other hand, I think has a big fat crush on Layla, and we can't blame him. We mentioned last episode, and we see it confirmed in this episode, that Layla is not really a character that we've seen in the comics. In the comics, Moon Knight had Marlene, but Layla is a completely original character to the MCU. What makes her really compelling to watch is how she relates to Steven, because Steven's personality seems to be made up of different aspects of Layla's personality. Whether that's the poetry book that they both share as a favorite, or learning hieroglyphics and learning about Egyptology, it definitely seems that this could be a character that was born of some kind of trauma. Maybe the divorce, or maybe a big fight between Marc and her created Steven's mind. I don't know how long he hasn't been in control, but Layla certainly seems like a key to answering a lot about the history of Marc Spector. But this also means that we have to answer some questions about Layla's past. I'm mostly interested in why Khonshu is looking at her as the next avatar. It could just be an intimidation tactic to get Marc to comply, or Steven to comply, but I don't blame him for eyeing her because she seems to be a pretty well-seasoned fighter. She's tough, and it doesn't seem like she's afraid of a lot of things, so I can see her being a really functional avatar. Moon Knight Layla? We'll see.
That's worth exploring, isn't it?
Now, heading into episode 3, I definitely have some lingering questions left over. First one that comes to mind is, what does being in Egypt mean for the show, and how will that affect the plot? Now, Steven's expertise in Egyptology is definitely going to come into play here, because whatever he knows will likely lead them to wherever they need to go, whether that's the same tomb that Harrow's looking for, or a completely different MacGuffin that we've yet to see in the show. I think that this location is going to really bring to the forefront the importance of Steven and Marc's working relationship and how that affects them in being the hero of this story. Now, I kind of mentioned this before, but I do wonder how long Marc was in control of the body before Steven even found out. I wonder how much of Steven's life is just fiction in his own head versus what Marc has allowed him to experience, because they state that there used to be a wall between them, and obviously all the precautions that he was taking to keep Steven from ever finding out that side of his life were pretty extreme. So I do wonder if that's going to come into play later, how long he's been Steven versus Marc, if Steven has been someone that's been with him for a long time, or did him meeting Khonshu in the desert split his mind like it did in the comics. Look, I told you guys last time that things were going to get weird in the MCU, and they're getting weird. We've seen alternate dimensions in our world, like the Mirror Dimension in Doctor Strange, or in Shang-Chi, Tao Lo seems to have a bunch of mystical creatures that the human eye has not seen before. In this world, these supernatural creatures are running around in our world, but we can't see them. This is opening up a brand new door of weirdness and dark things that go bump in the night in the Moon Knight series, because it gives him a purpose to be in the MCU, because this is the first time that we're seeing something like this. It's definitely an interesting visual component, because we even see Layla fighting this invisible beast in this episode, and she's able to get it. So it's not necessarily that these animals or these creatures exist in a different dimension, but they somehow have some kind of like supernatural barrier that keeps them camouflaged on our world. I also think it's really interesting that Arthur Harrow's energy is purple. In the past in the MCU, we've seen purple indicate, the Power Stone, or Agatha Harkness had purple evil magic. I wonder if it's kind of in that realm, if it's cosmic, if it's evil. But then again, I'm getting ahead of myself because Miss Marvel has shown that there's purple energy that could be used for good. I don't know what's going on with that. It could just be a color choice. It looks nice, but I do wonder if there's a deeper meaning there. And speaking of power, we're wondering, where does Moon Knight draw his power from? In the comics, in some iterations, he's affected by the lunar cycle. The fuller the moon, the stronger the Moon Knight. But in this particular show, he just feels like a supernatural superhero who is just a little bit stronger, a little bit faster, and has a really cool costume. I don't know if the lunar cycle, if the moon will come into play in terms of giving him power, but they've seemed to omitted any of those kind of Batman-like elements that people like to see, and just made him a supernatural mummy ninja, which I'm down for.
Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. My name's Steven with a V.
Overall, I think episode 2 was a banger. It's keeping the story moving, and we actually got a whole lot more information as to like where we're going. A lot of questions. I definitely want to hear what you guys are thinking. Let me know if I missed anything in the comments or something I should take note of for the next episode, because we definitely want to hear from you guys. Now, make sure that you're subscribed to our channel and have those notifications turned on, because we're doing this every week. We're talking Moon Knight analysis, and we'll be back for episode 3 next week.